Hello everybody, welcome to today's exam revision Saturday session. This is junior cycle history, and what we're going to look at today is we're looking at patterns of change and in relation to crime and punishment. So we'll go through today, we'll have a look at some of the sample papers questions in relation to this topic of patterns of change. So if we have a look first, we'll start off with these are the two learning outcomes that specifically are in relation to the patterns of change. So the first one here is 3.11, and that says to explore the contribution of technology developments and innovation to historical change. And secondly, 3.14, which is to illustrate patterns of change across different time periods in a chosen theme relating to life and society, such as crime and punishment, food and drink, work and leisure, fashion and appearance, or health and medicine. And in particular, this is the one we are going to look at today. We're mostly looking at 3.14. So it's to illustrate the patterns of change. And we're going to look at some different time periods throughout this hour. So what we're going to focus on is crime and punishment. So the patterns of change, there's different topics you can focus on. So some of you in your classes with your teachers may be looking at different ones. So there's food and drink, work and leisure, fashion and appearance, health and medicine, and then finally crime and punishment. So you might not be doing crime and punishment in your class with your own teachers. You might be doing one of these other four topics, but this is the one we're going to focus on today. But we will be looking at how to answer the questions that are in relation to this topic as well. So it will come in handy even if you're not studying crime and punishment, just in how to maybe phrase your answers and how to look at approach the questions. So with that said, we'll jump right in and we'll get started. So we will first have a look at these are the sample questions on the pattern of change. So in the sample exam paper that was been given out, I've gone through it and I've selected 3 questions that are directly linked to the pattern of change learning outcome. So the first one is here. It says, as part of your junior cycle history course, you studied patterns of change across different time periods in a chosen theme relating to life and society. So it just says to name the theme you studied. So that would be one of the previous themes we just looked at, for example, crime and punishment. Second question here is to explain 3 changes or developments that took place in relation to this theme that you've studied. And then finally, the last one here is, in your opinion, which of these developments was the most significant, and then to give a reason for your answer. So what we're going to look at today is we're going to look at a few different periods of time. We're going to look at 4 periods of time in particular and focus on how that relates to crime and punishment. And we will then have a look at these questions and how best to kind of approach them. So we'll continue on. So this is what we will be looking at today. So we'll be looking at crime and punishment through the following time periods. So these are the time periods I've focused on. As I said as well, this could be different for you. So even if you're looking at crime and punishment, you might actually be looking at different time periods. So what we'll look at today is we'll look at ancient Rome, medieval time, industrial Britain, and modern times. So these are the 4 kind of topics we are going to look at today. We're going to explore each of these and how each of them relates to crime and punishment and what's different, what has developed, and what is similar. So we're going to be kind of comparing them as we go through today. So we'll be comparing ancient Rome, the medieval times, industrial Britain, and modern times, and how crime and punishment has changed or adapted throughout that time. So in the way we're going to look at this is we will go through, I've divided it into 4 sections when we look at crime and punishment. So the first thing is we're going to look at who made the law. We're then going to look at who enforced the law, what types of crimes were there, and finally, what types of punishments was there. So when we're looking at who made the law, we're going to just focus on who made the particular laws during that time period. Then when we look at who enforced the law, is obviously who is actually in charge to actually make sure that this law is upheld. So the law that has been set is actually upheld. We'll then look at types of crimes that were common, and we'll notice there's a lot of kind of similarity between the types of crime that were common and then maybe how they've developed and adapted over that time as well. And finally, we'll look at the types of punishments that people had as a result of these crimes. So with that said, we will get started with our first question. So if we have a look here, this is from the sample paper. So this one is straightforward enough. It just says, as part of your junior cycle history course, you study patterns of change across different time periods in a chosen theme relating to life and society. And you have to name the theme you studied. So this is straightforward enough. So this is going to be one of those 5 themes we looked at the start. So as you know, we are looking at crime and punishment today. So all you have to do for this question is literally just fill in your theme that you have been studying throughout your 3 years of the junior cycle history. And that's why we're going to look at crime and punishment here. So let's move on. We will have a look at ancient Rome now. And we'll look at this learning outcome 3.1. So learning outcome 3.1 says to investigate the lives of people in one ancient or medieval civilization of their choosing. So the ancient civilization we're going to choose here is ancient Rome. And we're going to explain how the actions and or achievements of that civilization contributed to the history of Europe and or the wider world. So this also ties into our patterns of change, okay? So there's kind of two big learning outcomes kind of covered here just by looking at ancient Rome itself. So we'll have a look first. Who actually made the laws in ancient Rome? So there were the 12 tables. The 12 tables was a written code of law in Rome, okay? And this was created by the Roman emperors and senators. So this was a written code for all people to follow. What these laws did was they showed Romans what Romans could do legally. So it informed them on what was legal in Rome at the time and what would be a crime. So this is really important here when we look at who made the laws, because the laws were created by the emperors and the Senate in ancient Rome itself. So the emperor of Rome and the Senate would often make these laws, and then people would follow these laws. So that's our first kind of topic there. Remember I said we'll have a look to see, we'll have each topic, and the first one here is we're looking at who made the laws. So we know who made the laws now. It's the emperors and the Senate. And this one here is important, okay? So the 12 tables, this is literally, so it's a written down code of law. So it was actually written down at the time as well, so for people to follow. We'll then move on to who enforced these laws. So it was the main responsibility of soldiers in towns and cities to enforce these laws in ancient Rome. But it was a bit different to kind of modern day. So modern day, obviously, we have the police who will go on patrols and so on as well and help to try to prevent crime. Soldiers in ancient Rome, they didn't actually patrol the cities in order to prevent crime. So they would have been stationed at the barracks, or also at important kind of buildings at the Senate and so on. And their kind of main role here in terms of upholding the law was people would come to the soldiers if a crime had been committed. So that's the important thing here. So it's different to like the modern day police. These are soldiers. They're paid for a different job, but people would come to the soldiers if a crime had been committed, and then it would be the soldiers' responsibility to apprehend anyone that had committed these crimes. Another thing that happened in ancient Rome in terms of enforcing laws there were vigils. So the vigil's job was really important. So the vigil was at night time. So at night time, there was essentially like a patrolling unit out just to ensure that no crimes were being committed and to protect the towns and the cities, to keep an eye over them. So that's 2 now. So we've looked at so far who made the laws. So we know the emperors and the Senate made the laws. And then secondly, who enforced these laws. And we know that the soldiers kept order in the town. So the soldiers, it was their responsibility to then enforce the laws of the emperor. So what were some of the common crimes in Rome? So some of the common crimes in Rome, which would still be kind of common today, we have robbery and burglary. We also have arson, which is burning down buildings, and then finally murder, okay? So these would have been probably our 4 most common crimes that would have taken place in Rome at this time. And there was different levels of punishment and different forms of punishment based around these crimes that had been committed. It was what would happen in Rome was if someone committed a crime, it was up to the person who the crime was committed upon. It was up to them or their family, if they were murdered, to gather evidence and bring the evidence to the soldiers to prove the person's guilt. So it's different to modern day as well. There's no judges. It was essentially you had to gather your evidence. So if you were robbed, you would gather evidence on who you believed robbed you, and you would bring that forward to the soldiers or to local governments or local governments to have a look, and then you would bring your evidence to them, and that's how crimes would be judged. And then if the evidence was deemed sufficient, then it would lead to some of the punishments, which we are going to have a look at next. But these are 4 kind of common ones that we're going to look at here. These are probably the 4 most common crimes that happened in ancient Rome at this time. And then if we move on here, we are going to have a look at punishments. So punishments in Rome were very severe, and the main idea behind this was to deter people from committing these crimes. So the idea is that if the punishments are harsh, people won't want to re-offend, so they won't want to do the same crime again, because they will know how severe the punishment is, but also it's to warn other people about not committing crimes. So there's 2 kind of main ideas of punishment here, and this is really important to remember for later on when we're looking back at our questions, our exam questions, because what we're going to have to look at is how these things develop. So we have to look at how punishment develops. So the main thing here really to focus on is that at this time, punishments in Rome, they're there to deter people from recommitting crimes. So they're really severe in order so people don't commit crimes again. Punishment was also based on your position in society. So if you were a member of like in the higher ends of society, okay, like a patrician, okay, so in the upper echelons of society in ancient Rome, your punishment would be different to someone that was part of the plebeians, okay, so the lower form in society. So there's a big class divide here as well, which is another thing to remember if we think in modern day. Punishment is not based on your position in society nowadays. And as I said, so punishment is treated differently depending on your position in society. And in ancient Rome, the people who were down on the lowest end of society were the slaves. So these were actually treated the most harshly. Whipping and executions were quite common at this time as well. So these are some of the forms of punishment. So whipping, and these would be public whippings and public executions. And once again, the idea behind these public executions is to deter people from committing these crimes. It was also a form of entertainment for some people. So executions took place in the Colosseum, and lots of people would go, but the idea is that this was ingrained in society then. If you commit these certain crimes that were deemed illegal, you could be executed or whipped, and the idea is that people won't want to commit these crimes again. For those, as I said, punishments were different. So for those in higher society, they could often be exiled from the empire itself, so they would have to leave the Roman Empire. So depending on the type of crime they committed, they could also be executed, but often what would happen is they would be exiled from the Roman Empire. So they would have to leave the Roman Empire itself, which was punishment in itself, because they would lose the protection of being as a member of the Roman Empire and being in the Roman Empire, but also as they were higher up in society, they'd often be quite wealthy, and obviously they would lose a lot of this kind of wealth as well. So the idea again here is to let those in higher society know as well that there's these other punishments for them. So what I have done here is we're going to add to this table each time. So this is their table here. We're going to add to this. So this is going to guide us when we're looking at how crime and punishment developed. So the first thing is we look at who made the laws. So the emperors and the Senate made the laws, as we said, okay, so who made the laws? And we have the emperors and the Senate. And we're going to use this guide for later on when we're going through the sample questions. Secondly, who enforced the laws? So we have soldiers here, and this isn't a guide for that's all you should write. This is just a guide to help us as we're going through these. So we have the soldiers enforce the laws, and then we can look back over each of the slides then to help us when we're actually answering our questions. So finally, we have common crimes. So we have arson, murder, burglary, and robbery, and we're going to look at how lots of these crimes stay the same, but then how they also develop over time, which will help us answer the question. And finally, we have the types of punishment. So we have whipping, execution, and exile. Now, what I should clarify, guys, is these common crimes obviously aren't all the crimes that are committed, but these would probably be the most common that would happen. And the same with these types of punishments. These were probably the most popular forms of punishment in the ancient Roman Empire. So we have exile here, but just remember that that's only for those that really in higher society. Okay, and then we will have a move on now. So we've looked at ancient Rome. So we have this table here filled out. We are going to next look at medieval times, and then we're going to add to this table again. We're going to come back to this table, and it will help us kind of compare and contrast each of these 4 sections that we've chosen. So who made the laws, who enforced the laws, the common crimes, and the types of punishments that took place. So we'll move on, and we will have a look at medieval times now. So medieval times. So obviously same again with when we looked at ancient Rome. So we're looking at patterns of change. Okay, so this is mostly focusing on learning outcome 3.14, but also medieval times covers learning outcome 3.6, which is to explore life and death in medieval times. So there's also on the sample paper there is a question based around describing life and or death in medieval times, and you can actually use this information here in order to expand on your answer on that question as well. So you can talk about what type of crimes happened and how people will be punished based on these crimes. So when we look at medieval times, there's actually kind of some more learning outcomes that are covered here, so that will also help us going forward. So if we have a look here, we have who made the laws. So the land was owned by the king, and the king would make the laws in his own land. So we have here, so I'll go through and I'll explain this here. So on the left here we have a pyramid, and this pyramid basically is showing us the feudal system. So the feudal system was how medieval society kind of worked out. So what we had at the very top, we have a king. Okay, so we have the king at the top, and the king rules their kingdom. So in Europe during medieval times, there's lots of different kingdoms, and the king would rule their kingdom. And then below them were the lords, okay, and these are vassals to the king, okay. So as in these were loyal to the king. These group of people here in this section here, okay, including the clergy as well, okay. So we can see religious figures as well here. These are vassals to the king, so these are loyal to the king. So the king would give them land, they would be given land, and they would be given peasants as well, okay. So they're given 5 peasants, okay, and to basically help run their land, and what in return they would give to the king was loyalty and also military aid. So they had land, and they would have their own soldiers who would fight on behalf of the king. Then if we go down to our next section, so that's our lords, okay, and then the lords, what they would going down into our next section here, which are the knights, okay, and these are vassals to the lords. So these are the people who are loyal to the lords, okay. So we have the lords are loyal to the king, and then the knights are loyal to their lords. So the lords would give the knights food, protection, and shelter, okay? So this is what they were giving to their knights, and in return their knights would pay homage to them and give them military service, okay? So the knights would give military service to the lords, who would then give the king military aid if the king was at war with another king. And then finally, if we look down here, we have our last group, which are the peasants and the serfs, okay? So the knights, what the knights would do, the knights would give food, shelter, and protection to the peasants, and in return, the peasants would farm the land that the knights owned, and they would pay rent to the knights. So this is kind of how society was. This is the feudal system in the Middle Ages. So this land was owned by the king. This was the king's kingdom. So the king would make the laws in his own land. So in each kingdom, they would have different laws, and these laws would be created by their king. So that's our next section now. So we know who made the laws for the kings. What we'll have a look at now is whose responsibility it was to then make sure that these laws were actually enforced. So if we look at who enforced the law, so the king would appoint a sheriff to oversee law and order in his kingdom. The king would then also appoint judges who would travel around the kingdom to try crimes. So I'll go through each of these and we'll explain them. So the king would appoint a sheriff, okay, and then that sheriff's job was to oversee law and order in his kingdom. So they would travel. Each one of them was in charge of a certain section that they had to oversee the law and order. So a lot of these would be lords, and they would have to then impose the king's law. So whatever that particular king's law was, they would then impose it in that land. But the king would also appoint judges, and the judge's job was then to travel around when someone was accused of a crime, to actually judge on if that person had committed the crime or not. This is important because before this, and the idea behind this was, it was to try get rid of trial by combat. So a lot of time before there were judges to judge over crimes, people could have a trial by combat. So essentially, they could fight their way to innocence. So the idea was that they could choose to have a trial by combat, which meant they could fight somebody, and if they lived, that proved that they were innocent because God had protected them. That was the idea behind this. But to kind of get rid of this, the kings brought in judges who would then travel around their kingdoms to try these crimes. So that's two now. So we know who brought in the laws, which would be the king of each kingdom, and secondly, who enforced the laws was the sheriff, and then the judges would help enforce these laws as well. So what were some of the common crimes? So if you notice again, we have some very similar ones, okay? So robbery, arson, and murder have come up again, and they will come up often, okay? So these crimes will come up through each of the sections we're going to look at. So what I want to focus on then is we'll look at these next two, which is stealing crops and poaching. So the first one is stealing crops. So obviously, when we look back, we'll go back and we'll have a look at the feudal system here, okay? And the peasants would farm the land, okay? So they would have to farm the land, so they would each have a small part of land they would have to farm. But if you were seen to steal crops from another farm, you would be punished. So that was a crime to steal crops. Secondly, poaching. So the important thing here, many of these lords in the Middle Ages would have had land, their own land, and on this land they could also hunt. It was illegal for any other person who wasn't the person who owned that land to then hunt on that land, and then this was poaching. So these are two big crimes, okay? So if you hunted on land that wasn't yours, it would be illegal, so you'd be tried for poaching, and the same for stealing crops if you had stole crops. So they are two big crimes. So these are kind of common crimes that would have taken place in the Middle Ages, and what we'll look at next is we'll have a look at the punishments. So these punishments were also severe, and the main idea behind this, once again, is to deter people from committing crimes. Okay, so just like in ancient Rome, so we can say that again, they are two common traits, okay? They're severe, and the idea is to stop people wanting to commit these crimes, or to warn people off from committing crimes. So thieves often had their hands cut off. So if you were seen to have stolen something and had been found guilty, you would often have your hand cut off, okay? So this was to let people know. People would then know that you were a thief. Executions were also done in public for very similar reasons to in ancient Rome. It's to warn people about the dangers of committing crime. And then finally, if we look here at this image here, okay, and this relates to our last point here, which is for some crimes, people were put in stocks or pillories in order to humiliate them. So the idea behind this here is that they commit a crime and they will be put in the middle of the town, where they will be locked in the stocks here or the pillories, and basically for people can throw things at them and insult them. So it's in order to let people know this person has committed a crime, and then this is their way of humiliating the people. So we will move on then, and we will have a look at our table again, and we'll be able to compare and contrast now while looking at ancient Rome and the Middle Ages. So we're going to compare our patterns of change. So once again, I've filled in the section here on the right, which is our medieval time now. So we have who made the laws, so it's the king of each kingdom. So this is different here. So if we look at ancient Rome, the emperors and the Senate would make the laws. Okay, the emperors ruled over a large empire. These kingdoms would have been much smaller than the Roman Empire. So each kingdom would have their own laws. But who enforced the laws? So in ancient Rome, we have the soldiers enforce the laws. Meanwhile, in medieval time, we have sheriffs and judges would have been in charge of enforcing the laws. The common crimes that took place are very similar. Okay, we have arson, murder, robbery. Okay, comes up both times. Okay, but then we have poaching and stealing crops are really common in the Middle Ages as well. So that's kind of, you can see how kind of things have developed. Okay, more people. There's many lords now, okay, they have lots of land, so obviously if you're seen to be stealing essentially from the lord, that's a new crime as well. And then if we look at types of punishments, there's actually kind of quite similar ones. So we have execution, the public execution. thieves would have their hands cut off, and then public humiliation in stocks or pillories. So this is kind of a different one. This compared to here, so we can kind of see this type of punishment is probably for less severe crimes, okay? And the idea is to publicly humiliate people. So other people will know they've committed a crime, and it will warn them off from committing that same crime. That's the idea behind it. So that's our first two patterns of change, our first two topics in the patterns of change. So we're going to move on. We have two more to cover, and then we're going to look at how we will answer the question then based on it. So if we move on now, we are going to look at industrial Britain. So industrial Britain, if we look here, so this also ties in to our other learning outcome based around patterns of change, okay, when you're looking at industrial Britain. So that's 3.11, which is to explore the contribution of technology developments and innovation to historical change. Okay, so the technological developments, this is all in relation to industrial Britain as well. So you might cover this learning outcome or part of this learning outcome when you're looking at industrial Britain with your own teachers. So what we're going to look at again is we're going to look at our four main topics again. So we're going to look at who made the laws, who enforced the laws, the types of crimes that were common, and then the punishments. So if we look here, who made the laws? So the government made the laws in industrial Britain. So the British government made the laws. So these were laws that would cover the whole country of England, and then the rest of Britain as well. So the government made these laws in industrial Britain. So it's important. These are kind of more, they're putting more effort here. It's very similar if we look at Rome. Okay, so the Senate would have had a say in making laws. So the government has a say in making laws here. So we can add that then, we'll add that to our table, that the government made laws in industrial Britain. So then it's important to look at this next one here, which is who enforced the laws. So in 1892, the first professional police force was founded in London, okay? So first professional police force was founded in London in 1892. Their main job was to patrol the streets and prevent crime. So if we look here, this is the first kind of sense where we're getting their job is actually to prevent crime. So when we looked at Rome, the soldier's job was to arrest people after a crime had been committed. This is where we can kind of see things developing and changing, which we can add later on, is that we can actually see now there is change coming. There are actually people trying to prevent crime before they even happen. So one, the police will work as a natural deterrent. If people see the police walking about, okay, they're less likely to commit crimes within range of the police. So that's one thing. And then secondly, it gives a chance to actually kind of prevent the crimes before they happen or as they're happening rather than after they've already happened. Later on, detective sections were set up to solve crimes. Okay, so we first have the police, who their job is to patrol the streets, and then after that we get some detective sections whose literal job is to solve these crimes. So if we think back again to ancient Rome and we look at how when the law was enforced, or when someone was accusing someone of being guilty or not guilty, they would have to get their own evidence and prove that the person was guilty or not guilty. But this is different here if we look. Okay, so there's actual sections of the police set up who are actually investigating these crimes that have happened and gathering the evidence themselves. So if we have a look at what kind of crimes were common, it's quite similar again. So if we look on, so things do kind of branch out. So we had looked at that robbery and burglary were quite common in both ancient Rome and medieval, in the medieval times. But now things have started to change. Many large banks have been set up by this time in industrial Britain. So bank robberies start to become a big type of crime and a common crime. So less kind of robbing kind of smaller things. Now people are actually robbing from banks. Also, as it's industrial Britain, there's lots more jobs for people, there's lots more opportunities for people to have jobs. So theft from workplaces actually starts to rise as well at this time. So people taking stuff from their actual workplaces. If we then move on to the next one, so white collar crime, okay, so crime of high society as well kind of becomes quite big at this time, and in particular corruption, okay, so that is a big one which would have been prevalent in all kind of stages of time in history, but in particular here it starts to really kind of ramp up. And then finally petty theft. So once again, we kind of see robbery and so on. And we would have had murders, and obviously like arson still would have existed, okay, but more so these are kind of becoming our common kind of crimes at this time. So we'll add that to the table very shortly, and we'll move on to our next section. So finally, punishments. So once again, like all kind of punishments, it's still used as a deterrent, okay, but attitudes to punishment change in the 19th century. So the main idea still is you have punishment so people don't commit these crimes again, or people never commit the crime. But attitudes towards punishment change. So one thing, okay, it is a punishment, okay, you need to be punished for the crime, but not just only as a deterrent, things start to change. So in the 18th century, hanging was very common for many different types of crimes. But by the 19th century, the attitudes to this had completely changed. So hanging was then reserved only for what was deemed the most serious crimes. So we can kind of see a change here already, even in just this particular topic alone, okay? So industrial Britain, as kind of things start to improve economically, kind of people start questioning kind of what's going on and questioning how society is, and people then, so hanging becomes less kind of common, and it's only reserved for serious crimes. So the idea of punishment actually changes at this time. So one thing, it's being done because someone has committed a crime, it's to deter them, but the idea of punishment, they start getting this idea that it should be used to improve the offender. Okay, so this idea that punishment is used to improve the person who's committed the crime starts to grow. So not just to punish them or kill them, like if we look at hanging and so on, it's now looking at how can they then punish people but will help to improve them. So two other things that were common at this time was transportation to Australia. So what would happen was if someone committed a particular crime, they might be transported to Australia to work for settlers there, okay? So settlers that had gone to Australia, they would be essentially prisoners would be sent there, and they would have to work for these settlers for 7 years. And after the 7 years were up, they were free to return to Britain, but most of them mainly stayed in Australia because as they were criminals beforehand and they were working for 7 years here for these settlers for free, many of them couldn't afford to go back to Britain, so they stayed in Australia. But this kind of then starts to die down with improvements in the prison system. So the prison system begins to grow in Britain at this time, and also conditions start to improve. So the government starts to look at how they can improve these prisons and what they can add to the prisons as we to think about how can we actually punish people, but in terms of how do we improve them. So not only do we give them a severe punishment that deters them, how can we train these people or educate these people not to commit these crimes? And this kind of starts to be growing at this time in industrial Britain. So once again, we will add that to our table over here. So comparing patterns of change. So you can see it's starting to really fill up now. So if we look over here, we have industrial Britain on the right hand side. And the first one says, who made the laws? So the British government, okay? So if we're looking at industrial Britain, it's the British government that made these laws. Who enforced the laws? So we go across and we have our professional police forces enforce these laws. So different again, okay? So if we look, we have soldiers here who had to enforce the laws. We then have sheriffs and judges. And finally now we actually have a professional police force enforcing these laws. The common crimes, so we have our bank robberies, our petty theft, stealing from workplaces, and corruption, okay? So there's a lot more kind of stealing going on here, okay, as people become more wealthy. Also crimes in terms of stealing from wealthy people kind of starts to ramp up here as well, and stealing from businesses and stealing from banks, okay? And then finally the types of punishment. So a common punishment was transportation to Australia. Okay, so that was one, and then we also look at the prison system was also reformed, okay? So if we think of the types of punishment is now used as a way of improving the person who was offended, and not just as a way of completely deterring them from crime, okay? It's not just a deterrent from crime now, it's also used to improve people. Executions are obviously, so hanging is much less common as well at this time. So that will bring us on nicely to our final one now. So if we have a look here, we are looking at modern times. So the factors influencing modern crime and punishment. So we're looking at modern times, and we're first going to look at these different factors that help to influence modern crime and punishment. So when we're looking here, we're looking from mostly the 1960s onwards when we say modern times. So what type of factors help to influence modern crime and punishment? Well, here are just some social divisions, okay? So social divisions and different diverse societies also changes how crime and punishment changes over time. Economic changes, okay? So even if we think of industrial Britain again, okay, as people became more wealthy, more crime in terms of stealing and robbery and bank robberies, okay, that starts to develop, okay? So this is kind of ways in which crime and punishment changes over time. Public opinion, obviously, and then we have the growth of cities and towns. As cities and towns grow, there is the potential for there to be more people committing crimes as the population is growing. And then finally, the public attitude and opinion will also alter how crime and punishment is viewed. So based on public opinion, we'll deem generally what type of punishments they feel are acceptable or people feel are acceptable as well, and that will change over time, which we'll notice. So if we look at who makes the laws, well, in modern times, it's generally governments, okay? So governments around the world make the laws in their own country. So that's the idea behind it. So the governments of countries, they'll make the laws in their own country. That's straightforward enough, and we will continue on then. So then we look at who enforces these laws. So as we looked in industrial Britain, okay, it was our first professional police force. So if we look here, it's the police have become specialised, okay. So we looked at the start of detective units in industrial Britain, but now we even have like specialised forces in the police, so such as those that will just focus on fraud, those that will focus on traffic and other kind of factors in crime. So they're a lot more specialised. So the police aren't just patrolling streets, they're also investigating these crimes, and there's people who are specially trained in different branches of law enforcement. We also have the formation of kind of neighbourhood watches as well, okay? So these have been kind of set up in different communities, and the idea is to encourage communities to look out for one another. So that's the idea behind it. So it's not so much that they're enforcing laws, but they're looking out for each other, and then they can, if they could see a crime being committed, they can obviously, in their neighbourhood, they can contact the police as well, and so on. We'll then move on to our next section, which are the common kind of crimes. So this is where we see a huge kind of leap in the type of crimes that develop. So if we have a look here, some common crimes. So with the growth of the internet, this is where online theft becomes really big. Online theft and fraud, okay? So these are two big ones that have developed over time. So they're new variations on what we've had before. We've had theft before as we look through each of the time periods, but now online theft with the rise of the internet starts to grow, and fraud. We also have the rise of terrorism, okay? So terrorism has been around for centuries, but the idea behind it is it's grown in terms of kind of the modern day, okay? Thanks to easier access to transport and even easier access to weapons and so on. So terrorism has grown. Also, with our more diverse society, we also have seen a rise in hate crimes, okay? So crimes against people based on their race, sexual orientation, gender, and so on. And then even based on their religion, okay? So we notice kind of a rise in hate crimes as well as society becomes more diverse. And then finally, we have traffic-related crimes. So this one is straightforward enough. There's more traffic on the roads. There's more potential people breaking the law at this time, okay, in terms of traffic and so on, or accidents happening, okay, or other kind of crimes in relation to traffic. So these are some of the more common crimes nowadays, but some of them still tie into what we've looked at before. They've just varied or kind of branched out. So in particular, online theft and fraud. And then finally, the punishments, okay? So as we looked at before with industrial Britain, the prisons were reformed. So they were further reformed again in modern times, okay? They've had some great improvements made to them in order to improve the conditions for those prisoners in these prisons. Workshops have been set up to give prisoners more opportunities, okay? So to train prisoners in certain skills they may not have had before, in order to educate them. So it's that kind of idea again to improve prisoners so they don't commit crimes again instead. So there's the rise in that. There's also some things in order to help prisoners both mentally as well. So family visits become allowed in prisons at this time, in order to kind of give people that sense of they're working towards something when they're in prison. Okay, they work towards something else and to get out. In many countries, then the death penalty has been abolished. Okay, so in many countries in the world, the death penalty has been completely abolished. This is a big thing because especially if we look back to ancient Rome and medieval ages, the there's lots of executions, okay, as punishment, but the death penalty has all but been abolished in many countries in the world. Also, for crime that's committed, people aren't just being sent to prison now as well. So some people have to do community service orders, okay, so that's being given jobs to do in their community in order to improve their community and to add to the community. And then also for young offenders, before this, if you were a young offender, you would often be tried still as an adult, and you would be punished the way an adult would be and sent to adult prisons. But what we notice in the rise of kind of modern age, in modern times, institutions are then set up for young offenders. So this is another key aspect here. And if we then go to our table here, we can have a look. So this is comparing our patterns of change. So in the modern times, we have governments in each country, they make their own laws. Who enforces these laws? It's the police and special divisions and branches. And then we also have, there's neighbourhood watches that have been set up in order to kind of look after their communities as well. The common crimes, so before we had our burglary and our robbery and so on, and then moves on to bank robberies and stealing from workplaces. We then have online theft and fraud, okay? So we can kind of see it developing, okay? They're very similar crimes, okay? Just as time and society has changed, so too has those crimes. And then the types of punishment. So if we look down here, we have workshops that are set up to improve life for prisoners. The death penalty is abolished in many countries. Community service is brought in, so not just people are being sent to jail. And then finally, institutions are set up for young offenders. So that is our table complete there now. So that's going to help us when we are looking at the exam question next. So we're going to have a look at our second exam question now. So this one says, explain 3 changes or developments that took place in relation to the theme that you've studied. So what this question wants to know is you have to pick 3 changes or developments that took place in relation to the theme you studied. So our theme is crime and punishment. And then when it says 3 changes, if we look back here, I have 4 changes here. I have who made the laws, who enforced the laws, our common crimes, and our types of punishments. So really it wants 3 changes. So you're going to pick 3 of these, okay, to focus on. And the 3 I'm going to look at is who enforced the laws, the common crimes that took place, and finally the types of punishment. So if we have a look here, who enforced the laws? I am going to go here and I'll add that in here. So who enforced the laws? And what I have here is, in the medieval times, law was enforced by sheriffs. Their main role was to impose the law of the king. But by the 19th century, professional police forces started to form in Britain. And their main role was to prevent crimes before they had happened. Okay, so that is my first section. I've covered my first change. So the first change I look at is who enforced the laws. And it's important here, if you look at my answer that I have here, I've only focused on 2 of the time periods I was looking at, because it just says explain 3 changes. So here's my first change, or developments that took place in relation to the theme you studied. The theme was crime and punishment. That doesn't mean you need to focus and put down every single time period you focused on, because you only have this small amount of space, okay? And you have to write 3 changes. So if you focus on 2 time periods here, that is perfectly fine, okay? So we've referenced that they had sheriffs and what their main role was, and then later on we talked about how that has changed, okay? So the king had sheriffs, and then we talk about professional police forces that are set up. Our second one we are going to look at is common crimes. So if we have a look here, so we're looking at common crimes. So we're going to think of crimes that were important or common at that time. So this is our next kind of development or change. So I have here many crimes that were common in ancient Rome and medieval times, such as murder and theft, still exist. Common crimes today are often variations of older crimes. So cyber crimes, such as online theft and fraud, have grown and are modern day variations of theft, okay? So we mentioned that. So what I've done here is I mentioned that murder and theft were common in ancient Rome and medieval times. So I talked about how they were common there, and then what I referenced then is that it still happens now, but that cybercrime or online theft is just another variation of this. So I've actually put down 3 different time periods here. I have ancient Rome and medieval times, and then I've referenced how in modern day we still have, it's developed that now these kind of theft and so on has also moved online thanks to kind of modern developments with the internet. And finally, the last one I focus on were types of punishment. So if we have a look here, I have in ancient Rome and medieval times, punishment was severe. So I've referenced back then, okay, I've referenced 2 time periods here, and I've mentioned how punishment was severe. Executions were common. In the 19th century, a move towards punishment being used to improve the offender happened. So what I have here is, in ancient Rome and medieval times, punishment was severe, and that executions were quite common. But then I reference here then that in the 19th century, a move towards punishment being used to improve the offender happened. And in modern times, this was further expanded on with the introduction of workshops, so prisoners could learn new skills while in prison. So what I've done here, I've actually covered all 4 time periods I was focusing on. So I mentioned how executions are common in Rome and medieval times. I then talk about how as things change and develop, they move away from kind of punishing people through executions and so on to punishing people by trying to improve them. Okay, so punishment start focusing on how they can improve offenders rather than in medieval and ancient times people are executed. And then I even go on to then talk about in modern time, and I say in modern time this was further expanded on with the introduction of workshops, so prisoners could learn new skills while in prison. So that is our next section done there. So explain 3 changes or developments that took place in relation to the theme you studied. And I've given my 3 themes, and I've explained each of them or how they've changed in one way or another. And finally, the last question here. Now this one will be a bit different. So this says, in your opinion, which of these developments was the most significant? And you have to give a reason for your answer. So this one is fairly straightforward. So it's just, in your opinion, which of these developments was the most significant? So it's focusing on one of these 3 developments. So either that I'm focusing on here, so who enforced the laws, the common crimes, or the types of punishments that took place. So for example, if I just said types of punishments, I could have, so in your opinion, which of these developments was the most significant? So I would say, in my opinion, I believe that the types of punishments was the most significant. So it's the most significant change, and I'm going to give my reason. So your reason then is just explaining why you believe that. So maybe I would say how originally if you committed a crime you would be executed, but we've moved away from that now. So the idea behind it is that things are changing, things are improving for people. As we go, modern times have changed. Okay, so the biggest significant change is that we've moved away from executing people, and that punishment now in terms of a modern day society, the aim of it is to improve the person that has offended. Okay, so they're still being punished for the crime they committed, but it's also to improve them so they don't commit this crime again. So this one is based on your opinion. You just have to be able to expand on your answer, give reasons why you believe that is the most important. And just finally, before I finish up there, I just want to remind everyone to follow us on social media. So we're on many apps here. So we have Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and YouTube. So if you follow any of us there, you can follow our exam revision stuff there. That would be great. And if anyone has any questions, just feel free to pop them in the chat before I finish up there. Right, guys, okay, so I'm going to let you go now, and thank you everybody for listening.